All right, welcome back to Morning Express. It's now 20 minutes to 8 and today's Wednesday. And on Wednesdays, we'll look at your health. Now, today, we'd like to look at something different. And have you ever gone to a pharmacy and asked for medicine and they told you that we don't have the brand that you're looking for? However, we have a generic. And you're left thinking, well, generic, is that something I really want to get? Is it real? Is it genuine? Is it fake? And we'd like to demystify that this morning. And joining me in studio, I have Mr. Vimal Patel, who's the Managing Director for Cosmos. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you. Good morning.
Let's start, first of all, with a very brief background of what Cosmos does and what Cosmos is all about.
Okay, so good morning to everybody. So Cosmos is a generic manufacturing company. It's been there for about 30 years. It's a family-owned business. It was started by my father. And the whole purpose of Cosmos being there was, in the early years, everything was imported. My father felt that we needed to manufacture medicines and bring medicines affordable to the general public with good quality. So that's what Cosmos does. It's into manufacturing of HIV, anti-TB, as well as NCDs such as hypertension, and anti-diabetic medicines, etc.
Okay, so there's that notion. And how long has Cosmos been doing this?
Since 1984, genuinely going into manufacturing, etc.
Okay,
yeah.
And you do this locally?
We do everything locally. We formulate locally. We don't have any tie-ups with any multinationals or etc. We do everything in-house.
Okay. Now, it's good we've got that out of the way. The big question is on generic medicine. Like I started by mentioning, if you went to a pharmacist, so many people, when they go to a pharmacist and they're given a specific kind of brand to buy, and the lady or the gentleman behind the counter says, I don't have that brand, but I have a generic, there is a tendency to feel and think that the generic is either fake or not as good as the brand. Demystify this for us.
Okay, so basically, you got the brands, which are the innovator products that we all know that they do research and they come out with medicines and they have 20 years of patent, right? The generics, it's almost like a copy version. But the difference is that it's not the branded product, it's got the same quality. I think this has been by a lot of publications trying to show, and it's part of branding. Yeah? So when you want to sell your product, you try to say that, no, we're the brand, those are cheap. It's not like that. In the UK, in the 1990s, it went all generic. A lot of countries have gone generic. Why? Because you bring the cost of medicine down, right? The generics they go through the same quality stringent regulations and capabilities as the innovator. And we have to all go through that.
Okay.
So there is no reason to think that generic is a substandard, yeah? But on the other end, you know, we get a lot of products that are being imported from India, Bangladesh, China. I can't say which are good generics and which are bad generics.
Okay.
I think it's part of the PPB that has to regulate these things. Yeah.
All right. Help me understand, because as I was reading about this, there was the notion that those who have the brand that are a little bit more expensive have, let me say, put time into research, into generating that particular medicine, and therefore it is patented for a specific amount of time, and that takes the cost up. However, after that time elapsed, then they are allowed to share the formula, and this is now what forms the generic. However, that formula is as good as the original. Is that true?
Yeah, so it's true that the multinationals are there, and it's good to have these multinationals because they go into research and they create these molecules which are used for specific treatments, you know. And what happens is, because there is a cost into the research, the clinical trials, etc., there is a patent period of 20 years, for which they can recoup all their research costs, etc. And they do make a lot of money as well. So there's nothing wrong with that. But the way the world is, that after 20 years, they say, okay, so no longer patent exclusivity. So that's when the generics come in. In fact, the generics companies such as even Cosmos, they work about 2 to 3 years ahead of the patent coming off, because we have to do a lot of research, we have to do a lot of stability trials, etc., to prove that our product is safe, efficacious, and with quality and affordability. And that's when we go into registration with PPB.
Okay. So, generally speaking, when a generic medicine is being made, what tests and quality, analysis does it go through to ensure that it's as good as the original? Is it as good as the original, or is it slightly less? Maybe just to get that fact out.
I think the word good and less should be taken. It's equivalent, I would say. Okay. Because people think that testing quality is going into the lab and just doing some test. Yeah. Remember, like for example in Cosmos, if I'm making 5 million tablets of a particular batch, it takes about 8 hours to produce it on a compression machine. Now, if I'm going to sample 20 tablets, it's hardly a sample that is equivalent to
the amount of production
tablet,
you've done.
Yeah? So quality is not just about testing. Sure, we test, we have all these sophisticated instruments, but quality is inbuilt by looking at people doing the work properly, ensuring that the parameters of the productions are kept. So we have in-process controls, and all those controls that we have people being trained how to operate, people being trained onto GMP, etc. These are the value addition that you give. In the laboratory, they're tested according to the pharmacopoeias, which is an international guideline on specifications of medicines, etc. So we do a lot of this. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's let me tell you something. Like my dad is now almost 89 years old, and he happens to be our biggest guinea pig. So whenever we formulate medicines, and because of his 89 and he suffers from diabetes, hypertension, etc., all these new medicines that he would first want to take his own before trying to get multinational.
Well, that's one way of saying that he trusts his medicine and his brand,
so
which is a good thing.
Right?
Okay, now, before I come into the local production that we have countries like the US who have gone full generic on what the doctors prescribe, which is different from Kenya. Why hasn't Kenya reached there, especially given that our cost of medicine is very high and almost unaffordable for many Kenyans?
I think Kenya is in the evolution stage. We sometimes compare with the United States, or we compare against UK. They all went through that transition. Kenya needs that time to transit. And I think there's a lot of awareness right now coming through internet, medias, etc., that generic is the way. And I think the Ministry of Health and everybody, PPB, everybody, PSK, and all these organizations are working towards that goal. But you must understand that, there is a marketing game. And the marketing game is that you start branding things. When you start branding things, you start getting the premium price for it, right? Now, in the UK and in the United States, they started coming with the generics. So if you look at the NHS, when I was a pharmacist working in the UK, they had a list that if the NHS was going to pay, then they paid only for the generic. They would never pay for the brand.
Right.
Okay? So we need that kind of approach to go into that level. And I think the other issue is that branded products in the pharmacies, they have a better margin. So it's all about margins.
It's all about margins. All right, let's come to the cost advantage of procuring from local manufacturers. And first of all, let's start with the manufacturing part of it. You did mention that Cosmos manufactures locally. Do the products and the raw material, do you source them locally, or do you have to import that?
Okay, so most of the raw materials is imported. Okay, and it's imported from either Europe, India, China, US, depends. So it's all sourced. Packaging materials we source in Kenya. Yeah. So that's what we do. The other thing is that I'll talk about the pharmaceutical industry in Kenya per se, and then talk about what do we perceive as the cost of production in Kenya compared to imported, right? So Kenya has a population of about 45, 50 million people. We don't know the exact figures, but there are 40 manufacturers in Kenya, right? It's quite a sizable one. It's the biggest manufacturing hub between North Africa and South Africa. A lot of potential. So all these ingredients are imported, and there are a lot of manufacturers locally. We have a lot of, so that tells you there's a market competition as well. Yep. Now, we have this notion of importing, and I normally say to people, Kenya is a bit like Nakumet, that we tend to import a lot of goods. We have the capabilities, we have people who are qualified here, we have people who have invested here, and we make the same type of quality of medicines
that can
in
be made
Kenya. And it's easier for PPB to in fact visit us, see how we're doing our production, doctors to visit us. But when your medicine is coming from overseas, it's difficult, right? We've done some studies with our medicines that we manufacture for antihypertensive, anti-diabetics. And we find we are cheaper or cost affordable than even the imports coming from India, Bangladesh, and China.
Okay. And we tend to buy medicine from India. India, by all means and standards, is much cheaper than Kenyan medicine. What is it that India has done and have got it right that we need to emulate?
I think, India and Bangladesh and a number of countries, what they did. In the early 60s, India was one of the most expensive countries in terms of medicines. So they came out with certain legislation that they didn't recognize patents. They said if multinationals want to sell in their products in India, they need to put up a factory, which makes sense because you're creating employment, taxes, etc. And they had all these policies to promote local manufacturing. So for example, if the government was buying medicines, it would be first preference to the local Indian companies. And when that started going, they started collecting money and they started building the capacities within the company. And now after 20, 30 years, they're exporting to USA. The same thing Bangladesh is doing. I think that is what we need to look at. The blueprint is there, we just need to execute it. Remember, India has 1.2 billion, maybe 1.5 billion population. It's got about 50,000 manufacturing companies. There's some excellent companies, there's some medium companies, some lousy companies. So it depends where the medicines are coming from, which companies as well.
Okay, and in terms of our abilities, in terms labor force, I think we have affordable labor compared to India. Or do the numbers in India may possibly beat us in terms of having affordable labor?
I think, I think we're on par with affordable labor, I don't think that is a big issue in my opinion, okay? The biggest issue, if we talk about the labor capacities, are at the higher level. Simply because Kenya is an emerging market in that sense, and India has already been in that business for the last 30, 40 years, so they've got people who are trained in that high-level technical background. But we're not very far. We can bring those people and train our Kenyans. In terms of affordability, we don't have any issue on that labor area.
Okay. All right. And there's also now the question of the Big Four. Kenya right now is running with the Big Four as per Jubilee's agenda. And looking at Cosmos, you seem to be playing into two of them. There's one to do with manufacturing, if we are manufacturing these medicines locally, and two, the question of UHC, universal healthcare. How are you partnering with the government to ensure that this Big Four agenda is realized?
Okay, so one of the strategies that Cosmos has done is try and engage with the government as well as insurance companies, right? In the sense that we're trying to look at where, if they bought from us or any other local company, look at the cost and they could put it on their list of medicines that they would reimburse. So we started working on the private sector as well as the government. We started through Cosmos, through FKPM, which is the body that governs the local manufacturers, have been working and engaging with the Ministry of Health, the CS, Honorable Cecily Kirgirki, etc., to see how we can bring in this aspect of cost of medicine. A lot of people view cost of medicines as manufacturing companies making a lot of money. It's a myth. Everybody makes money, right? It's a question of how big that gap.
Right.
Now, when the medicines come out from our factories, and by the time they get to the Wananchi, then there's a lot of processes or companies' value chain that it goes through. And that is where the cost
Goes
escalates.
up.
Yeah, so if something leaves at 10 shillings, it might end up at 20 shillings or 30 shillings.
What are those things in between that would push that cost
Yeah,
up?
so they're retailers, they're wholesalers, they're all these people in between. And that's what we now need to regulate that.
Okay.
Okay.
Does the government need to step in now and regulate it and ensure that there is a cap?
Yeah, I think
Because
government has to step in. I think also it's our business and media's and everybody's business to educate the Wananchi, right? I mean, the Wananchis don't know about all these things as what is a local manufacturer, is there a good quality, what's the price I should be expecting, what should I go and demand in the pharmacy, yeah? I think that's all a question of education, and there's certain policies we need to put into place that will encourage, first of all, the availability, affordability, the quality of medicines at an affordable price.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do we have the capacity locally, in your opinion, to manufacture and produce, let's say, a good percentage of the medicine that we need for the things that ail us? Because again, we can contextualize this to our local market. What the US possibly suffers in terms of their biggest diseases may not be what Kenya suffers. We do have our unique problems or challenges. Would that possibly help us in concentrate on what our big challenges and ensure that we produce and manufacture in that line?
Yeah, I
Make it
think so. I think so, because you see, I mean, all the multinationals are not interested with what specific diseases Kenya suffers from. They don't get that kind of revenue. All right, they get exposure in terms of corporate social responsibility, etc. I think the local companies are fully capable, and I'm going to give you some statistics, right? Everybody says that if you give it to local companies, you won't have the quality, you won't have the right medicines, the quantities for Kenya's demand. I think that's not true. If you look at Kenya today and Cosmos, according to IMS data, we're the number one company in terms of unit sales in this country. Okay? If you look at the volume supplied by local companies to Kenya is almost 70%. Okay? Volume is 70%, but the cost is 30%. That means that the 70% of the total cost of the budget of medicines goes outside. So it is there.
It is there.
Yeah? And I think it's a transition that somebody has to make a bold decision, just like they have done for a lot of other industries. And I will tell you something, that 60% of all the medicines are bought by KEMSA. And the KEMSA is doing a good job. The problem is that our Public Procurement Act is not conclusive helping the local manufacturers. For example, they say that we give you 25% or 20% preferential treatment to local manufacturers, but an importer will get 10% with the Kenyan shareholding. So it means a 5% differential. Why would somebody want to invest in this country if that is the case?
When that's the case.
Yeah? So these sort of policies need to be checked into. We talk about India, we talk about Bangladesh. India and Bangladesh put policies to support local manufacturers, and in time when these companies started growing, they started putting quality, they started building into, and now today they're exporting to US and the UK. And I think that's what we need to do.
All right, we'll need your parting shot as we wind up. But as you do that, your advice to Kenyans on generic medicine, and secondly, locally produced medicine. What is your advice to Kenyans, and what would you like them to know? Because there is that perception that when it's locally made, somehow there is something wrong about its quality.
I think, I've just talked about the myth behind the quality and generic and substandard, right? I think my advice to the Wananchi is that go to the pharmacy. It's the pharmacist's responsibility to provide the right advice. Yes, you have the multinational product, then you've got an imported generic, and you've got a local. And I advise people that the local generics are equivalent, yeah, but you have an affordability. The second thing is that putting a local manufacturing company here is that you get availability. And remember that when you're on NCD treatments like antihypertensives, anti-diabetes, you need to take your medicines. And I'll give you an example. We're working with a couple of organizations, so trying to get medicines to the Vananchi in the rural areas. And what we are doing, we're helping in donating medicines first as an initial capital, and then educating the Vananchis through a clinical offices, and these Vananchis are going and getting affordable treatment. So in a way, we need to start doing things like that to educate. Yeah?
Well, thank you, Mr. Vimal Patel, for joining us this morning and, giving us that wonderful information on generic medicine. And we hope that we can manufacture more and buy Kenya, build Kenya.
Just a parting thing that you mentioned about quality, right? So Cosmos, has been inspected by a number of multinationals. They've been inspected by a PICS organization in Europe. We've passed it. We're in the process of getting WHO. So it's that myth about quality needs to be put aside. And I would advise anybody who wants to come and see my factory to come and
They're welcome to do that.
Okay.